Tens of thousands rally in London demanding more be done to help refugees arriving in Europe. Politicians starting to listen. So, is people power more important than we think? Can it really change global policies? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. Well, the refugee crisis is unprecedented and unfolding before our very eyes. Every day, thousands of people fleeing war, poverty and oppression arrive on Europe's shores. Their journey has been desperate and their arrival far from welcome. But in the true spirit of people power, the refugees have continued to push forward. So much so, EU leaders will now meet on Monday to discuss major changes to their migration laws. And public outcry has also played a part. Leaders like the UK's David Cameron and Australia's Tony Abbott have backtracked slightly. They say they will open their doors to more refugees. Well, meanwhile, tens of thousands of people rallied in London on Saturday, calling for far greater support for refugees. Barnaby Phillips was there.
The crowd has been marching up Piccadilly in the centre of London. Certainly there are thousands and thousands of people here, and they are arguing that Britain is not living up to its historical, indeed its moral obligations. We just saw a man holding a large banner that said Germany won, Britain nil. The implication being that Germany is doing enough and Britain is not. But does this crowd really represent Middle England? That's what David Cameron, the Conservative Prime Minister, will be wondering. He has been cautious so far on the question of Syrian refugees, but he was elected just a short time ago with a commitment to reduce immigrant numbers coming to Britain. And it's important to remember that in this country, the refugee crisis, the question of how many people should come into Britain, be allowed to be into Britain, is entangled with the wider question of immigration as a whole. For Inside Story, this is Barnaby Phillips on Piccadilly in central London.
Well, the protests in London are just one example of civilians taking action where governments have been slower to do so. Earlier this week, Danish civilians defied police by offering refugees free lifts towards Sweden, even after being threatened with arrest. On Monday, a Greek passenger ferry used its lifeboats to save migrants from drowning. The Blue Star One rescued 35 migrants and alerted the Coast Guard so it could save more. And in Calais, Irish, English and Belgian organisations have been providing food and easy-to-build shelters for the thousands living in Jules Ferry camp. Time to bring the guests into the show. In London, we have John Hilary, Executive Director of War on Want, one of the organisations supporting the Refugees Welcome Here rally. In Malta, Martin Xuereb, Director of the Migrant Offshore Aid Station. And in Core, Switzerland, Tino Sanandaji, economist at the Swedish School of Economics. Welcome to you all. If I could start with John Hilary. Is concerted political action really effective?
Oh, I think it really is. What we've seen in Britain over the past few days has been nothing short of a miracle, because for so many years we've been told that you can't have any political discourse on refugees or on migration which isn't anti-immigration. It's always been about cracking down on migrants, cracking down on refugees. And what we've seen today and in the past few days is a massive outpouring of people saying, no, we want an alternative story, we want an alternative narrative which says that refugees are welcome here and that we, the people of Britain, do not agree with the politicians' message that we've always got to be saying, no, shut the borders. Instead, people want to say, we're opening the borders, we are people, we can see that the refugees fleeing these horrific situations are also people, let them in and let's do the right thing.
But John, has it really made that much of an impact to government policy? I mean, yes, the Prime Minister of the UK, for example, has said that Britain will now take 20,000 Syrian refugees, you know, compared to earlier this year when the UK government was talking about cutting support for asylum seekers with children. But when you look at the numbers that he's talking about, that isn't a real big amount of, or a really large number of refugees.
I agree that it's only the tiniest first step, but what's interesting is that David Cameron has already had to back down within just a couple of days of the pressure being on. And I've just come from the big rally here with tens of thousands of people on the streets of London. What was interesting is that all of the other political leaders have chosen to address that rally. So you've had political spokespeople from all of the other parties feeling that it's in their interest to come out and to be associated with that refugees welcome here message. So I think what it's doing is it's trying to change the discourse. It's changing the narrative around refugees, around migration, so that other politicians feel that it's in their interest to stand behind it. And that can only be good for the long term, because it means we're changing the rules of the game. It's no longer just about saying no refugees, no migration. It's where other politicians are coming behind this movement and saying, we believe that we should be doing our part. Britain should be doing much, much more.
I like the expression you used there, John, the rules of the game. Let me take that one to Tino, though, and ask, are the rules of the game changing? Are we witnessing a sort of really historic moment where under the feet of people, unarmed, peaceful protesters and refugees, the rules of the game, the political game, are changing, Tino?
I'm not sure if the rules are changing. We certainly see a massive groundwell of altruism and goodwill toward refugees. But the problem is we don't really have a debate, should we help refugees? Almost everybody in the West, in Europe or in the United States agrees. The question is to understand the mechanisms of the wider Mediterranean has in a few years turned into a mass grave.
But Tino, let me jump in here. Haven't the rules changed and the mechanisms changed in at least one sense when you look at some of the rules, like the Dublin Accord and understanding about how refugees should only be settled in their first point of entry? Hasn't there been some kind of change there that perhaps John was advocating?
Yes, you have. That's exactly. So you have a crisis where the European lax immigration is attracting more and more people to cross the Mediterranean, so that we have 40 times as many people or 20 times as many who drown. So rules are changing, but in a paradoxical way, where the more people Europe lets in, the more people try to cross over, the more pressure they put on the immigration system, and the southern European countries, the continents of the Balkan, have stopped to enforce these rules. And unfortunately, this public reaction that you're seeing, of course, the altruism is very, very well, but because it's not enough to have good intentions. You also have to look at the consequence of what's happening. People misunderstand, I think, a lot of them, why we have 2,800 people who already this year drowned in the Mediterranean, whereas you had 20 people just 5 years ago who drowned. It's not because Europe has become less restrictionist in the 5 years. It's because Europe has stopped, as you said, enforcing Dublin. And because of that, there is what I call this, what the Europeans have created under a cloud of humanistic rhetoric, a death lottery, which is if you stay in Turkey or Lebanon or in Syria, we basically don't care about you. We throw you perhaps a pittance. But if you manage to come across, then you get permanent asylum in a welfare state. Well, then there's a 2% probability you're going to drown. So this is what's really going on. And, and what you see is some sort of macabre cycle where more protests are making the immigration rules more lax. Then you attract more refugees, you have more drownings, you have even more public sentiment because people, of course, react very emotionally to these pictures. Unfortunately, they don't really quite understand what's going on. And look, what the European Union is doing now, it's irrational. When you have 12 million Syrians running away, and you have in total 60 million people who are on flight, displaced, taking a few thousand more and dividing them.
12 million haven't ran away to Europe, have they? Let's get some of the numbers.
No, 12 million have run away either within Syria, or 4 million have run away to Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan.
The numbers I read on Turkey,
almost nobody is coming to Europe from Syria.
Not sure about those numbers. The numbers I had were 1.9 million for Syria. And
in Turkey it's 1.9. 4 million in total outside of Syria. 1.9 in Turkey.
Right.
And 4 million in total. You also have 1.2 in Lebanon, 600,000 in Jordan, 250,000 in Iraq, some in Egypt, about 300,000 in Europe. Almost nobody who is coming to Europe is running away from war. They first go to safe countries, such as Turkey in particular, and then they come over to Europe not to escape grenades, but because to get a better life.
All right,
and of course, that sentiment is quite...
Hang on. Yeah. All right, so I've got to pick up on that point in a second, but I want to go over to Martin Xuereb, because you're one of those people who have got together and want to make a difference, and you are making a difference. Tell us how your organization, what motivated people to come together and establish the Migrant Offshore Aid Station to make a difference to perhaps those humanitarian gaps that you saw left by governments and NGO institutions alike?
Well, first of all, I think we need to stop being cynical and try to distill all this issue to the bare bones. And when you do that, we all need to find that the lowest common denominator and agree that nobody deserves to die out at sea. I think in addition, we need to also agree, and this is something that we experience ourselves at sea all the time, is people who leave their homeland do so because they do not have an option. And the great majority of people that leave their homeland, they do so because it's not safe, they can't secure a future for themselves or for their children. So let's move away from this idea that people are going away from their homeland because Europe is a pull factor. Let's focus a bit more about less about the pull factors and more about the push factors. One other thing as well, which I needed...
Hang on, what about, Martin? I mean, the point which Tino made there, in his opinion, many of these people didn't come directly from a war zone. They came from other countries where they could have stayed.
Well, I'd like you to go and visit Lebanon and visit the camps in Turkey and visit the camps in Jordan, and you then tell me whether you would like to spend the next 5, 10, 15 years in those conditions. With all the good intentions and with all the great work that these three countries are doing. So they are, yes, leaving their homeland, and they're leaving a place of desperation. So the idea of people, obviously I'm talking in the great majority of cases. One other thing I wanted to pick up as well is that we need to extend the discussion a bit beyond Syria. Out at sea in the central Mediterranean, one other group that we have been assisting constantly are Eritreans. We are passing through, at this time in this world, a period of unprecedented change. There are more refugees around the world than there has ever been. We need to understand that and not necessarily try to find solutions to all of the problems. Let's start including in our processes to find solution. Look at the issue from the perspective of the individual that has no option.
Right. Okay. Let me take the discussion back to John, and I'm wondering here, will the goodwill continue? Perhaps the point which Tino is making, that this is kind of snowballing, and to use his words, people don't understand. Do people like you, may have the best intentions, as Tino would say, in the world, really understand that you could be creating a snowball effect where more and more people want to come to Europe? Will that goodwill and sentiment and the sort of shift in public policy that you were talking about continue if the numbers increase week on week, month on month?
I think we can build on the goodwill that we have at the moment, but I do also agree that people need to understand the reasons why people have fled their homes, and that predominantly is war. If you look in the British situation, we have the largest number of refugees coming from war-torn countries such as Afghanistan and Eritrea, as the previous speaker just said, but also you look around the world and the huge refugee populations from crises such as Iraq, Palestine, now living through 60 years of refugee crisis. And I think the key thing from our point of view at War on Want and others who are here in the movement to try to look at the refugee crisis at its roots is to say, who was responsible for the wars which have driven people to leave their homes? And for us in Britain, we recognise that the UK government bears a huge responsibility. You look at the crisis in Afghanistan, it was as a result of Western intervention. You look at the crisis from Iraq and Syria, it was as a result of the coalition forces who invaded and occupied Iraq, fomenting sectarian violence, putting Shia against Sunni and creating the vacuum into which the forces of what is now Islamic State moved. And then you look at the Palestinian refugee crisis, where Britain continues to support the Israeli military regime. And indeed, just this week, we saw David Cameron welcoming Benjamin Netanyahu to London as if there was nothing wrong. And that's where we need to start looking about the root causes of these refugee crises.
Right. When we're looking at the root causes, I want to go back to Martin, because you're an organisation which people get together and you go out with boats and try and rescue people in need in the Mediterranean and other places, I understand. I'm wondering what kind of response you get from governments, some of whom we're told, according to reports from NGOs, are not very welcoming. Their coast guards are not always very welcoming towards refugees. There are reports in some of the British newspapers quoting the UNHCR, Save the Children, Doctors Without Borders, as saying they've been told by refugees that, for example, what they claim are Greek commandos acting as pirates, robbing migrants at sea, puncturing their boats, trying to ensure they don't make it to Greece. Of course, I should point out the Greek authorities deny that and say those are criminal gangs. But I'm wondering, once you pull these people out of the sea then, Martin, and you take them ashore, what kind of response do you get?
Well, first of all, I need to underline that we operate in a particular area in the central Mediterranean. We operate north of Libya, around about 25, 35, up to 40 miles north of Libya. In that area, rescues are coordinated by the Italian Rescue Coordination Center. And I have to say a big thank you here to the Italian authorities who take up their responsibilities, not only their legal, but they're also their moral responsibilities very, very seriously in terms of coordinating rescue. Whenever we rescue people, it is the Rescue Coordination Center which will then give us a place of disembarkation. This year, since the 2nd of May, we've done over, I think, about 28 rescues, rescuing around about 9,000 people. In each and every case, we are given a place of disembarkation, which is either in Sicily or in southern Italy, and we have had no issues whatsoever.
Tell me more then, Martin. How do you rescue people? Are these all private boats, the volunteers, and how do you find people? Do you just trawl up and down looking for people?
No, we have a 40-meter boat. It's called the Phoenix. We're the Migrant Offshore Aid Station. This year, we're in partnership with Médecins Sans Frontières. They provide post-rescue care. We operate in two ways, reactive and proactive. We have 2 high-end drones which can patrol and cover 900 square kilometers in 6 hours. If we see a vessel of interest, we report that straight away to the coordinating center, to the Rome Rescue Coordination Center. We provide them with a visual. We tell them whether the boat is underway, stationary, how many people we think, what the weather, what the sea state is, what the state of the boat is. We then receive instructions from the Rescue Coordination Center. In many instances, however, we work in a reactive way. We actually get tasked to assist in the rescue of people by the Rome Rescue Coordination Center themselves. Mm-hmm. The way we operate is simple in a way, but it needs to be done very professionally. We have to deal with severely overloaded boats, which normally should take 30 to 40 people and would have 500 people on board. So these are boats under stress, mass rescue operations, which needs to be done professionally.
All right, Tino, there you were talking about it, perhaps snowboarding. It does seem to be snowboarding. It does seem that more and more people, perhaps like Martin's organisation, are getting involved. Why is that a bad thing? Why are you worried? You know, yes. Okay, let's look at some of the numbers you gave. If there's 1.9 million in Turkey, if there's, well, Jordan says the 1.4 million, the UNHCR says 600,000, but even so, in Lebanon, it's more than 1.1 million. These are small countries, at least in the case of Lebanon and Jordan, where the population of refugees represents a really big chunk of the native population. They haven't collapsed. The number I've read of so far, what Europe, if you compare the number of refugees from Syria, Afghanistan and Eritrea that Europe has taken as a whole so far. It's in the 0.something percentage, quite low. Why are you worried?
Well, if you look at Lebanon, for example, Lebanon, their entire budget for their 1.2 million refugees is something less than $1 billion per year. At the same time, Sweden is spending perhaps 5 to 10 billion a year to take a few thousand. So the resource allocation for anybody who's a rational humanist is a scandal. Basically, just slightly exaggerating, 99% of the resources are going to the 1% who get over to Europe. And by the way, that causes thousands of people to die en route. The logical thing, and look,
sorry, Tino, just to clarify the numbers there, are you saying 99% of Europe's resources are going towards refugees? Because surely that isn't right, is it?
No. Of the resources that Europe spends on refugees, something like close to, at least above 95% goes to domestic refugees, to a few thousand, and they give in total 5 billion, and that's not just Europe, everybody, to the UN refugee program. So the UN, to take Lebanon as an example, they have less than $1 billion they're getting from the West. And at the same time, they have 1 million refugees. And at the same time, the West is spending tens of billions to take a few thousand. Because the West is expensive. It has a lot of money, but it's expensive to take people, maybe by a factor of 10 or 100.
Right, well then, Tino, why does Germany feel so confident refugees can be a boost rather than a burden on the country? The Vice-Chancellor, Sigmar Gabriel, is quoted as saying, if we manage to quickly train those who come to us and get them back into work, we will solve one of our biggest problems for the economic future of our country, the skills shortage.
That is obviously politically correct rhetoric. You have the same rhetoric in Sweden. As if you look at the facts, they have extremely high rates of unemployment. And look, this is a fact. Germany has increasing their budget for refugees by about 6 billion euros. Okay? That's more than the entire budget of the UN refugee program globally. And you can look that up if you want. So they, of course, because of the political correctness and emotional arguments, people are sort of shutting down logic. And your guests were saying, for example, people are running from war, and use Eritrea as an example. There is no war in Eritrea. People are running away from Eritrea because it's a dictatorship. And if you look at Afghanistan, Sweden has now taken more refugees from Afghanistan this year than ever during the full-scale Afghan war. Of course, it's the pull factors that's causing this. And at the same time, the World Food Program is on its knees for lack of resources.
All right, I can see both of our guests.
And the Swedish government cutting the aid.
All right.
The Swedish government has cut $1 billion in aid and used it for internal refugees.
All right, you've made that point. I want to give both of our guests a final chance quickly in 40 seconds. John, tell me why you're shaking your head before I move on to see why Martin's shaking his head. John, go ahead.
I think it's ridiculous to suggest that people are just coming to Europe because they thought it might be funny to do so. The people who are fleeing from Afghanistan have faced a long-term crisis as a result of the West's invasion, the NATO-led invasion, and we know that the Taliban have moved into that vacuum. So let's be clear that the results of this are down to our intervention, and we have a right and a duty to clear it up.
You've made that point clearly. I want to give Martin a quick 30, 40 seconds as well to tell me why you were looking like you don't agree with this.
What my other fellow speaker is saying is incredulous. I have been out at sea. I have been on the boat. I have spoken to tens and hundreds of Eritreans who have spent 5, 6, 10, 15 years in the military service just because the regime will not allow them to leave. The idea of people leaving because they want to go on a holiday is incredulous. One other thing I want to say, I think we need to open the debate beyond Europe. The responsibility to save lives goes beyond Europe. This is a global issue that requires global solutions.
All right, I think I can see, Tino, I'm sure you want to come back with something else, but I'm afraid we are out of time, so we're going to have to leave it there. I think all of you gentlemen have all had an opportunity to make your positions and make your points and quote your stats and facts. So at this point, we'll just leave it to the viewer to decide, shall we? Let's thank our guests, John Hilary in London, in Malta, Martin Xuereb, and from Chur in Switzerland, Tino Sanandaji. And thank you for watching us. Of course, you can get in touch by going over to our programme page on our website, aljazeera.com. You can also leave a comment on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or tweet us at AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team for now, it's goodbye.